Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the Gilded Age, which was a time period in the late 1800s in American history after the Civil War. It was a time period when Reconstruction was ending, cities were rising, like New York City, Chicago, and others were expanding because of the introduction of steel and oil. So you had these very rich businessmen, robber barons, captains of industry, basically the men who built America and industrialization taking place. At the same time, out west, which is what we're going to focus on, you had the closing of the frontier, the last of the great Indian Wars, as Native Americans resisted white westward expansion onto their lands. And so this is going to be the topic of our lecture today. Our objective is the TEAC 13A, which focuses on the how and why of westward settlement. So please focus right here on your essential question. How and why was the Western United States settled by various groups? And what impact did this have for various social groups? So like Native Americans or businessmen or immigrant families, for instance. That is what our focus is going to be on. Now, when you are taking your notes over this video, what I would like for you to do is basically divide up your paper into these quadrants. So have a top section, draw a line, have a section on the left here, maybe about an inch and a half, 2 inches off from the edge of your left paper. Draw that line down, and then a section on the bottom. So draw a line about maybe 5, 6, if you're really big, maybe 8 lines up from the bottom. Now this is the basic Cornell notes. At the top, you're going to put your title and the subtitle. So for today's lesson, you would put at the very top of your notes, Unit 2, The Gilded Age, Section 1, Westward Expansion. You're going to put that right up here at the top, okay? And then for this left-hand section, that's usually where you put topic titles, notations. You could put also any additional questions you would like to ask, keywords, your own commentary, in other words, okay? So as you're going, that's where you can take notes on the notes or any special things you want to point out. Oops. Okay. And then for your essential question, I want you guys to put that right at the top of your big section. Now, this big section on the right, this is where you're going to actually put the notes. So you can take them however you want, but you should probably include at least the things that you'll see on the screen. So this is for the note taking. This is for your title and subtitle. This is for your own notes on the notes. And then down here, this will be for the summary at the end. And what you're going to answer in the summary is your essential question. So at this time, go ahead and please write your essential question at the top of your notes. How and why was the West settled, and what impact did this have for various social groups? You can pause this if you need time to write that down, but please make sure again that you write that down at the top of your notes. That's in this big section right here. And then you will need that and be focusing on that question as we go through this, because that is what you're going to answer in your summary. Okay. And then when you turn in these notes, you could just basically either type these notes on your computer, or the easiest thing, honestly, would be, especially like me, if you like to write this down, it's just easier to format it that way. You don't have to print off these Cornell note papers. Just take a picture of these notes and then you can submit it that way. Very easy. Okay, so let's get started. So how was westward expansion accomplished? How did various people go out west? Now think about, this is the late 1800s. Can they go by car? My smarties in here probably thinking, yeah, there were some cars around this. They were zooming. They had some like motorcycles and whatnot. Yeah, but only if you were super rich. And remember, there weren't really roads. So all these really like, horseless carriages that they had chugging along at like 15 miles an hour. Ooh, it was so fast. They couldn't really do much because there weren't roads for them to go on. They would fall apart very quickly on these gravel and dirt, things that they had instead of roads. And so the main way for most people to get around going over long distances, and this is why most people didn't travel very far from home during this time as well, was the train, railroads. Railroads and trains were kind of an invention of the early industrial revolution of the 1700s. They get going much better in the early 1800s. And by the late 1800s, railroads are really, that's where it's happening. That's what they got going on. The other way you got is just old fashioned get along. You got your horses, riding. But if you've ever ridden a horse for any length of time, you know that that can be pretty painful, not ideal, especially over a long distance journey. Um, there was also the Conestoga wagons. If you've ever played like Oregon Trail, we're going to talk a lot about that game. That was another method, but kind of the same uncomfortableness as maybe taking a horse. So you're very limited in how you can go. Here's some of those Conestoga wagons you can see with the oxen pulling them. This is along like the Oregon and Missouri trails, the Mormon trail that they took to like Utah, and other various Western trails that began in the early to mid 1800s and will continue during this time period we're talking about after the Civil War. And if you didn't know, it's okay. The Civil War ended in 1865. The Gilded Age really kind of begins in the 1880s, 1870s, kind of after Reconstruction. But we're talking about some themes that go throughout this time. History's fluid like that. Here is a steam engine, a train. The gauges and the trains had evolved over time as well. So obviously this is a much older train than what we have today, but it's the same basic ideas. Now, as far as the railroads go, uh, the big thing is going to be in 1869, the first railroad to traverse the entire nation, east to west, was completed. It was completed at Promontory Point, Utah, when President Ulysses S. Grant, might have remembered his name, he was the great Union general known as the Butcher, who helped to win for the North the Civil War. He became president after Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson, who had been impeached, left office. Grant was our 18th president. And so he got to drive in that golden stake to complete this monumental, historic railroad. It's called the Transcontinental Railroad because it traverses across the nation, east to west. So for the first time, you could go from like New York City, New York, all the way to San Francisco in just 9 days. And that was a trip that previously had taken like 6 months. That means you can move people, but also goods, supplies, that entire distance. It opens the West to enormous settlements. All these families can get on this railroad and they can go all the way west, or they could stop at points in the middle of the United States. And the US by the late 1800s will have more rails than any other country in the world. It opens the markets, like I said, on both coasts. It also means that you can have goods from the East Coast, from Chicago and New York, go by rail to California, to San Francisco, and then be loaded on boats, which opens up our trade to the entire world. Now it's much easier for us to send supplies, for instance, to Asia. We could send stuff from California to China or to Japan or to India. Because remember, before you'd have to go to the East Coast, like around Africa and all of that. So this really opens up the country, and it opens up our trade and our economy to a world market like we've never seen before. But negatively, it's also going to lead to a whole lot of new white settlers encroaching on Indian land out west. And so this is the setting for the Great Indian Wars. Here's a map showing you the railroads. You can see lots of railroads in the north. Now, during the Civil War, this gave the Union, the North, a huge advantage over the South. You could see it was much easier for them to move around people and supplies and other various things versus the South, whose actual, very few railroads, most of them led directly from plantation areas to the ocean. Because they were primarily interested in shipping their cotton off to world markets rather than moving people and supplies around the South itself. but you could see the underdevelopment there. Now the Transcontinental Railroad basically followed the mouse. It's going to go along this route here, through Nebraska, through Utah. So that's where it was completed, and then all the way out to California. This is the point where the two met. Remember that this all had previously existed. So really it was about building this piece and then building this piece to finally connect to the nation, east and west. Now, there were many, many immigrants who worked on the railroad. In fact, it would not have been possible without immigrant labor. You should know that the Irish immigrants were some of the main group that helped to build the railroad going from about here out to Utah. And then this is also kind of key to think about the geography. You have a huge mountain range that goes right here. That's the Rocky Mountains. And it was primarily Chinese immigrants building the railroad from the west going east, from California to Utah, going through those vast Rocky Mountains, having to use dynamite, nitroglycerin, other very dangerous properties to carve this railroad through those mountains. Go ahead and brainstorm 10 things you would need to survive on the Oregon Trail. If you've ever played the game, watch out, there's a snake in my boots. There's lots of hazardous animals, water crossings, the elements themselves, all sorts of things that can get you. So go ahead, just make a list like on the left side of your paper. You could do this of 10 things you would need. I'm going to supply you with the wagon itself and also with your own clothes and the oxen. Now, what else would you need to survive? This is a trip that would take about half a year, so several months. Think about that and then get back to me. We'll probably do a little discussion share with this later. So have that jotted down in your notes. And you could pause here and do that and then resume. You could also, in your notes, click right here and you can watch this video. Remember, these notes are uploaded on our classroom. So now we have the question, why? Why travel west? This goes to push and pull factors of migration. Push factors are those things that make you kind of have to leave a place. You're forced to go. Pull factors, you want to come because there's something drawing you in. Obviously, gold and silver, precious metals, these are things that make you want to come. So what is it, push or pull? It's pull factor. There had been a series of gold rushes prior to the Klondike in Alaska in 1896. This included in the 1840s in the Black Hills in Dakota. In the 1850s, you also had, 1848, gold was discovered in California. And then by 1849, you had the vast gold rush to California. If you like football teams, you might know of the San Francisco 49ers. They're named after the California gold rush. So there were many gold rushes in the United States, in the Westward territories and states that are going to pull people out west. The Klondike region is actually there between Yukon in Canada and Alaska. So this is the Klondike, like a Klondike bar, those ice cream bars, that's named after this region. Although I went to Alaska once, amazing trip. We did a lot of hiking. It was in the summer, so it wasn't like freezing like this. It's actually really, really nice there in the summer, although they have mosquitoes, like not kidding, like this big. But when I was in Alaska, it was like Skagway or somewhere, little town on the ocean, kind of like in the tail area. So kind of around right here. I remember going to a gas station and I was so excited to like ask for a Klondike bar, and the attendant there was totally confused. They didn't even know what I was talking about. I was like, yeah, I want a Klondike bar. It's an ice cream bar. It's, famous for Alaska. And they looked at me like I was a crazy Texan, and so I bought a different ice cream bar and said goodbye. But yeah, that's basically where we're talking about. Gold was discovered there in 1896, and in the ensuing couple years, you're going to get a lot of Americans, over 100,000, are going to travel west all for gold, elusive gold. And they're going to go up basically from Vancouver, that's in Canada right here, along British Columbia's coastline to Alaska's tail, and they're going to get to this region. Many will drop off before they make it. Many will die on the journey. Alaska has incredibly cold temperatures. It gets down to -60 during the winter, during certain blizzards and stuff. Basically, if you're out in the elements and those kind of temperatures, you're going to get frostbite, hypothermia, you're going to die. Even for those who sought shelter and had shelter, they often lost their pack animals, their donkeys, and then had to return back because they were unable to carry their supplies. Um, Many people will suffer not just from the extreme cold, but also depression and other emotional, mental problems that happen because Alaska is so far north that during the winter, they only get a few hours of daylight. So like, it's kind of cool, but well, it's also really cold. But in Alaska, in the height of the equinox in December, it's really only about 2 hours of daylight in December, and all the rest is nighttime. Just like in June in Alaska during the solstice, when the sun is up higher, then you have the opposite. You have like about only 2 hours of nighttime, and all the rest is daytime. When I was visiting some friends in Fairbanks, which is right kind of in the middle of Alaska, right there. This was again during the summer. I'd never been to Alaska in the winter. They let us stay in their basement, which had, those big, thick black curtains to kind of block out the sunlight, so that our circadian rhythms, our sleep cycle, could kind of adjust. We could believe it was nighttime, even though the sun was shining and it was, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. So Alaska is a very different place. The last thing I'm going to mention about the horrors and the agonizing trials and tribulations of the miners is the animals. And while you might be thinking bears and wolves and other things, which are definitely a concern, the most dangerous animal in Alaska to this day is actually the moose. They're very large and they're very territorial, especially during mating season. A female moose can weigh upwards of 3,000 pounds. That's more than a small car. And she will run you over if she feels like her babies are being threatened. So that's what's going on here, and the big takeaway is that this brings a lot of people out west. It also kind of helps to settle Alaska and bring renewed focus on this. We had gained Alaska right after the Civil War. We bought it from Russia. Our Secretary of State, William Seward, was mocked and ridiculed. He was made fun of for purchasing Alaska from Russia for several $millions. Which is super, super good buy by today's standards. But it was seen as a waste back in the day. People called it Seward's Folly, or, the Great Icebox. But when gold was discovered there, it made it all worthwhile. And then later on, when oil is discovered in Alaska, it's definitely made it worthwhile. Alaska is a treasure trove of rare resources and exotic animals. Miners who would go up to Alaska and have to go through cities like Juneau and Anchorage made those places put on the map. They also had these various towns and cities along the way for their gold mining and their panning. It's when you sift out the minerals to try to find little gold flakes in the river. When they did this, they set up these little towns, which flourished. And many people got rich not by finding gold, because there's only so much gold to be found, but by profiteering off the miners themselves, charging an arm and a leg for booze, or for brothels and women and ladies, or for just supplies in general. They jacked up the price on a lot of those things. Now, a lot of these towns dried up and became what we call ghost towns, but you could still see them today if you happen to go to Alaska. Another great pull factor for westward expansion is cheap available land out west. There's a lot of it, and that's going to be the major thing that brings a lot of people out there. It belonged to the federal government, and to try to encourage settlement and get the West tamed, especially out of Native American hands, the government is going to sell off this land incredibly cheap, almost for free. $1.25 an acre. You have to remember that things used to be cheaper back in the day. Like in the 1950s, a Coca-Cola was like a nickel versus today you go to Walt Disney World, it's like $10 or whatever. A car back in 1913 was, like $300. But however, all that being said, still $1.25 an acre is an incredible buy. I know, property values in our great city of Waco have been going up enormously the past 2-3 years. An acre today in Waco is more than actually the $14,950 you see there. An acre here today in Waco, depending on your proximity to the loop, could be up to 20, 30, even $50,000. And it was selling in the late 1800s for $1.25 an acre. So this was a big land grab. Now there were boomers and Sooners and squatters and all sorts of people who would just go out and claim land. Like they'd run out and get it before somebody else, put their flag there and say, "This is mine." And then they'd have a gun and say, "Don't get on my land. I got it." But then there were also many, many families, most of them immigrant families, who had newly arrived in the United States, who hear about this cheap land for sale. They get in their wagons, they get on the train, they go out west, they purchase this land. These were called homesteads. And in 1862, this is when the Homestead Act passed. It actually was in the middle of the Civil War in an effort for the federal government to gain revenue for the war under Lincoln. But these homesteads, these are going to be 160 acre plots of land sold at $1.25 an acre each. So $1.25 times 160, that's still a really, really good buy. So very accessible to a lot of these poor immigrant families. For them, this is the American dream. They come, many of them from Europe. Many of them had been living in squalor in small towns or in crowded cities, in apartments, and had never had land of their own. So this was the golden opportunity for them. And all they had to do in order to keep this land that was being sold virtually for free, these homesteads, was that within 5 years, they had to have shown that they had improved the land. And they could do this by 2 ways. The first one, build a house on it, a little homestead house. You're building on the prairie in the Great Plains, so there's not a lot of wood by this point in time. So thatch, you'd use like mud, clay, kind of what they used to make bricks out of today, kind of mixed in with hay and straw. And it's very earthen, very, very poor home, but it's a home. So you do that, that's one thing. And then the second thing that you would do was that you would have to plant crops. So you do those 2 things within 5 years, build a home, plant crops, and you get to keep your 160 acres, your homestead, at this very, very low, cheap price of just $1.25 an acre. So that is the Homestead Act. And more than any other law in our nation's history, this Homestead Act really helped to settle the West. It brought so many people out to the West. In fact, in total, 1.4 million homestead grants were issued by the federal government. It settled the West. The cattle boom is going to be what basically made Texas put on the map. And we will talk about that and more in our next lecture. But the cattle boom will be another one of those push-pull factors. And then in our second part to this lesson, we will talk about the end of the push-pull factors, the why, and we'll also address the social impacts. So on your note sheet, on this right here, you should have been filling up this. You should have a few, commentary things like your list for your Oregon Trail over here. You should have your title, subtitle. You should have your essential question at the top, but don't do your summary yet. We'll do the summary, like I said, when we finish the lesson, and that will be at the end of part 2. So keep a hold of this, and thank you. All right, now I just need to figure out how to stop doing this.